We're happy to have you here, Glenn. Happy to see you once again. And happy, of course, also to see so many attendees, attendance today, still rolling in. We have been looking forward to this session, this online seminar on target value design, and have in the Lean Construction Denmark have this topic on our study group earlier this year, and in Værdibyg, we are also having a project about budgeting and also managing and controlling the finance in a project. It's a topic that are of huge interest for us. But welcome everybody. My name is Morten. I am a project manager in Værdibyg and in Lean Construction Denmark. In Lean Construction Denmark, we have been working together, or have a cooperation with Glenn Ballard, one of the founding fathers of Lean Construction Institute for nearly 20 years. And as late as here in September, we had a seminar as well on last planner system. And today the main focus is target value design.
My objective is to explain what TVD is, how it works, how well it works when done right, how it can go wrong if done not right. I will also provide a brief history of how it's developed, and that's one of the reasons why the name has changed, and a report on current TVD research, which I think you'll find interesting. So I want to first go back to some, kind of start with history, if you will, and situate it in time. Target value delivery, TVD, is an adaptation for the construction industry from lean product development. Perhaps the most famous exponent of that is Toyota, but it's certainly not limited to Toyota. When we're making the lean development process is really along, let me say it this way, the Toyota product development system stands right alongside Toyota production system. They have a lot of intertwined principles, right, and presuppositions, fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and of work that they do. But if you think about it for a moment, the Toyota product development system is a closer analog to construction projects, right? So I'll come back to that. So, but the first application, and in that world of lean product development, they call this process target costing. And we decided not to call it target costing. Well, it initially was called target costing in construction. And it started the first successful project or application in construction of which I'm aware is this one shown on the screen, St. Olaf's College Fieldhouse. Right? The Fieldhouse is a gymnasium with sporting facilities, walk walls, running tracks, and so forth. Right? And let me tell you a little bit about this story. I was involved with it. I was working closely with a general contracting firm, Bolt Construction, which has been a real front runner, a leader, along with, they got involved at about the same time that Denmark formed a Lean Construction Institute, right? So around 1999, 2000. So it goes quite a ways back. But in this, it's a small, St. Olaf's College is a small liberal arts college located in Northfield, Minnesota. I think it's got 1,200 students, or it did at the time, something like that. So it's quite small. And one of its graduates, some years previously, was Tom Bolt, the president of the Bolt Company, right? And the architect from Ellerby Beckett, who designed the project, was also a graduate of St. Olaf's College. And so I think that on reflection, those kind of personal connections may have helped succeed a different and new approach that had not been previously done. Okay, right. So let's go. So here's a timeline just to give you some idea about what was going on. In a way, also, it was a kind of a historical accident, a blessing, as it turned out, that there was not too much complication about what the target cost was, because it was a donated project. It was a gifted, right? So in the spring of 2000, the Tostrud family, or all of their family for years had graduated from St. Olaf's, approached the college with an offer of a $9 million gift. And they asked them and then began to work with them to decide, well, what's the best way for the college to invest that money? And they came up with an agreement that it should be a field house. And they located it initially in the kind of the back of the campus or near the other parts of the playing fields, right? So they engaged an architect. They started doing visits around the country to other college field houses, and they decided to change where they were going to locate the building and to add more money in order to expand the design, because they were impressed in their visits with several places where they used the field house as a kind of entryway to the college as a whole, right? So they needed more money, and the Tostruds gave them, they increased the funding to $12 million. Actually, they increased the funding, that was for the building, also added another $1 million for operations and maintenance, because if you have a building that you don't maintain, it's not that much fun. So construction began in fall of 2001. You see this thing up in the upper right on the timeline, problem with site development. Just keep that in mind. We'll get to why that's in there in just a moment. Right? So here we go. So this has, apologies for the quality of graphics in 2002. Well, this was actually published in 2004, 2 years after the completion of the project. But what this represents is the allocation of that $12 million, right, to different kind of building systems, if you will, shell, interior, mechanical, electrical, and so forth, right? And site work also, of course, on the left-hand side. And that's was a hallmark of target costing and lean product development, and has been from the beginning a characteristic also of its application in construction. Now that became important because one of the cardinal rules of target value delivery, target costing, and whatever name you call it, is that the target cost cannot be exceeded, right? And if it is exceeded, and then also it's important to, obviously you have to give people some, say the mechanical team, some target for cost to match with the expected scope, right? The requested scope, in order to steer their decisions about this design or that design, right? So it's one of the criterion for design selection. Now, what happened was that when they changed the location of the building, it turns out the new location had very poor soil under one of the corners of the building, 1/4 of the building. And that increased the cost of site work from, it was here approximately $600,000. It went to almost 1.1 million, right? And in a budget of 12 million, that's a lot of money, right? And what happened was that mechanical and electrical were able to underrun their budget. They delivered their scope with two quality requirements. Everything is okay, but they spent less money. And so, and they had some contingency fund available. So a combination of contingency and the underruns in mechanical and electrical were used to make up that cost difference in site work. Right? So that's, again, a hallmark of the target value delivery approach, is that you have to be able to move money across organizational and contractual boundaries. And we'll say more about that as we go on. So this is just a graphic representing the idea of these target value design team clusters. And in the case of St. Olaf's, every one of these clusters had a client representative, a architectural representative, sometimes the same person, but a general contractor representative, and then the professionals design and construction for each of these different clusters. So for mechanical, electrical, plumbing, MEP, structural, building envelope, and so forth. Right? And this is from a later project that didn't have this, but you can see that this is how the individual clusters track their cost performance. Right? And maybe you can tell, it's hard to see, it's impossible to read it, of course, but take my word for it that some of them were over and some of them were under budget, their own budgets at the time of this report. Yeah. So all that said, let's look at the comparison or a performance. And it's rare that in construction or in construction projects or projects of any sort that you get a kind of natural experiment where you can say, well, this is so close to that that it's appropriate to compare them and draw conclusions from the comparison. So in that same city, only 2 years earlier, Carleton College, also small liberal arts college, had completed a similar field house. They called it a recreation center, but it had the same functionalities. They slightly different, see a little more than slightly, quite a bit different in size. St. Olaf's was larger in terms of gross square feet, 114,000 to 85,000 for something. And yet St. Olaf's was finished 10 months earlier and at a square foot cost per square foot about 1/3 less, okay? And I don't know this for a fact, but when I went there to collect data for writing a paper on this, which was published in actually it was presented in the International Group for Lean Construction 2004 conference in Helsingborg. Yeah. So, so the head of facilities for St. Olaf's told me that after the project was completed, Carleton College sent some representatives to look at it, and they went away saying that it was even more beautiful and better fit for purpose than theirs. So you get it faster, you get it cheaper, and you get it better. And that was a perhaps with some good fortune in historical accident. That was the starting point for target value delivery, target costing in construction, target value design. So that's a good start. Now, Bolt really is owed a debt of gratitude, I think, by the industry for immediately taking that idea, that approach, and applying it in a string of smaller, not always quite that small, but small-ish projects as a way of kind of testing and flexing your muscles and figuring out how to really do it well. And if you can read the paper that's available at the one I just mentioned at iglc.net. All of those papers are there downloadable for free. So, and in that paper, we talk about, well, what could we have done better, right? And so they kept working on that. And I think the very next project was for another, this one was a healthcare project for a small regional healthcare organization called Theta Care. And they were building an ambulatory care center in the town of Shawano in Wisconsin. And this is, again, a computer rendering of that building. And let me tell you a little bit, refer to my notes before I run past myself. Okay, this is it's about 20 million, but that included owner purchased equipment. And there was considerable, even though it was ambulatory care center, it had some considerable amount of imaging equipment, for diagnostic, healthcare diagnosis. About 75,000 square feet. Now, so This is a picture of the relationship between expected cost and target cost over the life of the project. And I think you can see that that's dotted line, horizontal line there that runs kind of through the orange is the target cost, and the see if I can get it. Yeah, so contingency is the orange band, owner changes were the yellow band, and the design cost. I'm sorry, I got it wrong. Let me do it from the bottom. So, yeah, no, I got it right. So the design cost is the green, and then blue is the construction cost, right? And again, we see here something that was it actually happened at St. Olaf's, but I hadn't mentioned it and hadn't paid that much attention to it until I saw it happen again. And that's that the success in meeting and really beating the target cost enabled value-adding addition of scope, right? And so in most of these cases that we've seen, and in many projects, it's rare that because they're all most of these have been in the private sector. I think in the public sector it might be different, but maybe not. That they weren't interested so much in getting money back into the treasury, their own treasury, but rather in getting more value for money. And that it was what's been enabled. So that, and we see here also a characteristic that seems to be characteristic, and where it doesn't happen is a signal that something went wrong. And I'll talk about that now in anatomize, if you will, a failed case of TBD. But what's peculiar, what I'm pointing at, is that the expected cost falls as the design becomes more complete, right? And it's not always even, it's always lumpy, right? So there's pushing and pulling, right? But what you're seeing is that the opposite of what tends to happen when you don't set the target cost and scope, the corresponding scope, prior to design, is that it tends to, as more of the design complexity becomes revealed in the addition of lines on drawings or models, right, the cost tends to go up. Now we're seeing it go down because we're steering the cost to target. So here's some project data on Shawano. $842,000 in cost savings were invested in value-adding scope. The remaining $45,000 in cost savings was returned to ThedaCare. The project was completed 3.5 months earlier than the projected 15.5 months, and the revenue generated in that 3.5 month period amounted to almost $1 million. And again, we're talking about relatively large sums on quite small projects. So one last one, because I want to kind of move this towards the West Coast. So this is the first project that Bolt did for Sutter. The Sutter healthcare system is the largest contractor healthcare company in the Northern California. I think now they have maybe 32 hospitals, so it's quite a large, but it's not a national firm. But they had committed in 2004, I believe, to lean project delivery for their capital program. And they didn't just immediately start building acute care hospitals, multi-million-dollar hospitals, but they first practiced on smaller projects. And this is a medical office building in Sutter's. They have a system of affiliates, and one of them is Fairfield Medical Center, I think it's called. So Sutter Fairfield Medical Office Building. And here we see quite clearly the relationship of the different costs, the expected or benchmark cost, the target cost, and the actual. Right? And the benchmark is what they had estimated that the project would cost if they did it conventionally. The target cost was what they thought it was really worth to them to have it, and the cost that they thought could be achieved. But they actually delivered it for less than that. And so, sorry, hang on, I could give you those in percentages. So the target cost, 18.9 million, was set 14.1% below the benchmark, the market cost. The actual cost for the original scope underran the target by 5.3% and underran the benchmark by 18.6%. Okay? So these are looking to be quite good. And this was also a project, the first project where target value delivery, TVD, was combined with an IPD type contractual arrangement, integrated project delivery. And I'm not going to talk much about integrated project delivery today, although it might be an interesting topic for the future, but it's a form of collaborative contracting that seems to fit very well with TVD, although it can also be done quite successfully without it, as had been done previously. So this, again, is a picture of the cost scope profile of the project. You can see it gets a little boring after a while. The cost falls over time. It going down to and below the target, leaving space for reinvestment of some funds in value adds for the client. And if you will, I can see that the text is horrible, so I've added these overlay notes so that you can, at your leisure, you can actually go back and look at it and see what happened. But the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in white on black at the bottom band refer to the numbers in the diagram. So 1, original concept construction budget; 2, start of target cost process; 3, added to scope; 4, increase in steel cost; remove 3% contingency, and so on. So you can begin to see how this actually works, I hope. But I'm sure you will have some questions. Okay, now that brings us up to 2012. And in 2012, the Project Production Systems Laboratory, of which I was research director at the time, invited Sutter Health's chief planner and architect, Dan Conwell, to come give us a report on what their experience had been in their application of lean in their capital program. And to that point, they had not completed, although they were just short of completing their first acute care hospital. And so that excluded those big projects, although there was some of the 22 that he reported. He said, I'm reporting on 22 lean projects, all more than $10 million in value, some a little bit much larger, but I think much larger meant maybe up to 50. So still small, relatively small. Lean referred at minimum to use of target value delivery and last planner. Okay, no projects were over budget or time. All projects were fit for purpose, and remember, this is the chief architect saying it. It's not our judgment; it's their own. Average cost 3.4% under budget, and average cost 15% under market. Okay? And this persuaded Sutter Health, because they knew this data before they gave it to us, to then move into the delivery of, I think it's now 4 major acute care hospitals that have been constructed using a combination of building information modeling, target value delivery, integrated project delivery contracts, and all of the last planner system and all the lean toolkit, right? And I think they've pretty much completed their major program. But of course, some other program will come up over time. Okay, so I know you can't read this. I'm going to try something tricky. Maybe you can read it. Can you read it? Can someone tell me, Martin?
It's a bit small. We can see some of the numbers. I can see some of the numbers for sure.
Let me.
Then the young people can read it. Yes.
I think I can do it this way.
Yep.
If I can move that. No, it's not moving. Ah, there we go. How's that?
Now we can read it.
Okay, so in 2011, our laboratory, P2SL, did a study working with another major main contractor, DPR, headquartered also in the West Coast near San Francisco, where we work. And we did a study. We did in 2011. We published this comparison. There were 3 different all healthcare projects. One, the UCSF, very large healthcare project, in a public sector too. So we started looking at different combinations of factors, of elements. And I had developed in, I think, 2009, a current process benchmark for target value delivery. And these are the elements in that benchmark. And we have had the teams on each of these projects evaluate themselves against these components. So I'll just read the first one. With the help of key service providers, the customer develops and evaluates the project business case and decides whether to fund a feasibility study, in part based on the gap between the project's allowable and market cost. And so the SMCCV hospital rated themselves in a scale of 1 to 5, a 4.1, with some variation, right? The mean of 3.4. I'm sorry. The next one was Alta Bates, Sutter Medical Center, 3.4, and then UCSF 2.3, right? And then if you sum all those up, you'll have these slides and you'll be able to see this in detail. So it goes all the way down. Okay. You can see things like number 14, target scope and cost are allocated to cross-functional TVD teams, typically by facility system, for example, structural, mechanical, electrical, exterior, interiors, etc. Right? And so we begin to have a way of seeing, well, what can we do to improve? Right? Okay, so that's there, and I'm going to go back to projection. Okay. And and last time I talked to you about the last planner system, and I reported on a 2020 current process benchmark for the last planner system, right? I will, if I live long enough, I will do an update. I think this is not actually the most current, but it's still very similar, but I will update the target value delivery process benchmark also. And update means show how we've improved it since the previous one. Right? So, if we're advocates of lean, we don't think we've ever got it just right. Okay, so let's go to, now that I've taken you through some cases and shared some data, hopefully to whet your appetite, let's go and look at, well, what is this target value delivery and how does it work? All right. And I offer a definition here, if you will, a process for setting and steering to project targets that delivers value to stakeholders within their constraints of time, cost, location, amount of carbon expelled into the atmosphere, the number of employment provided to local population, whatever is whatever they agree that their targets are. Right? And here about the names. It first, as I said, came into lean construction with the name target costing and construction to differentiate it from target costing and product development, which is used to manage product profitability, like the profitability over its lifetime of a Camry, let's say. Target value design came into use in lean construction because the fundamental target is delivery of value, not cost reduction for its own sake. Right? The cost that the allowable cost, that's the default value for the target cost, doesn't stand by itself. It's not the least that you can pay. It's the least you're willing to, the most you're willing to pay. Right? So, and finally, I propose target value delivery because value is not delivered until the project is constructed and released to the client for their use. Right? So I wanted to keep if we have targets, we want to make sure that we're understanding where the target is. Right? So here in broad strokes is the process. Develop a project business plan, set targets for what's wanted and conditions of satisfaction or constraints on its delivery, validate the proposed project and confirm targets, steer design to targets, and then steer construction to targets. Okay? So I'll take you through that in step-by-step fashion, if you will. So a small detour, where did TVD come from? And I mentioned its roots in the Toyota product development system. And from Toyota, we got this idea that allowable cost is derived from expected benefits in use, okay? And a whole life approach. So in Toyota, they subscribe to the principle, if you will, that everyone who touches or is touched by a product should be involved in its design. Right? And that's, of course, a tall order, but they mean both on the customer side and on the producer side. Right? And we can talk more about the TPDS system, Toyota Product Development System, as we go on. And then in going to the right-hand side of the diagram, I want to talk about its roots in the cost planning tradition, which I suspect you know about from your own history. Let's see what I have more on that. Let me look at my notes. Every once in a while, I have to remind myself to look at my notes because I go spinning off. So in the research that I'm going to talk about in a moment got me looking at the history more carefully, trying to understand, well, where do these different things come from and how do they fit together? And I don't think I fully understand it. But if we go on to this one here, so according to the cost planning tradition comes out of the quantity surveyor approach to cost management. And some of the, perhaps the authoritative voice is a book on cost planning by Ashworth and Pereira, specifically focused on buildings. So they report that cost planning was developed in the 1950s. And this is their words, not mine. Prior to which no method was available to estimate the cost of a building before it was designed and bids were received. Designs had often to be redrawn, and too often what was delivered was not fit for purpose. Now, I don't know how to contest their interpretation of history, but that was their starting point. And what they say, I won't, it's not all written down here. What they say is that after the Second World War, and there was some period of time where they were trying to kind of catch their breath and accumulate some funds for investment, many public institutions, schools, hospitals had been destroyed, and not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world. And at least in Europe, there was it seems to have been a quite broad uptake of cost planning. And if you look at how it's defined, look at elemental cost planning, designing to a cost. And it was also called target cost planning, since a cost limit is fixed and the design team must produce a design not to exceed that cost. And here is what will come back to in the research, because we're looking for better ways of doing conceptual estimating than are offered by the cost planning tradition. So it says cost limits are calculated using the financial method of approximate estimating, like cost per hospital bed. And of course, that changes the importance, the relevance of that metric changes with the increase in ambulatory care, right? That we saw an example of with Shawano. So it's going to be quite, the cost per student or cost per desk, the cost per bed, those are very rough methods of approximation, right? And or by the interpolation method, which I would call benchmarking, right? Where the cost is based on other similar schemes that are then the sort of completed projects that you can that you know the parameters of what functions were performed with what sizes, right, quantities, number of operations, and so on, and you can make an adjustment to fit what you're planning to build. But again, I will come back to it. But again, there's even according to the cost planning people, those methods have very limited accuracy. Okay, and then a variant is here. Kind of has another, reminds us a little bit about our examples of target value delivery. Comparative cost planning, and it says here various design solutions are developed and the one offering the best value for money is selected. Okay, and we have some examples of that application, that version, if you will, of TVD from our UCSF campus. And more to be said in just a moment. Okay, now also in the same, although I can't find the connecting ligaments, right? But in much later in 1980 in Finland, Hattila, in fact, Hattila is the name of a person, Irjana Hattila, and Irjana Hattila and his second in command, Ari Pennanen, are on my TVD research team that we're working on, that I'll report on in just a minute. Well, that's more than a minute, but they came up with something apparently independent of both lean, or Japanese product development, and independent of the British tradition or the quantity surveyor tradition of cost planning. But it's essentially the same, right? So I'm beginning to get a picture. I hope I'm communicating it successfully, that there's these different streams, these ideas and experiences kind of loose in the world. And I'm sure that they interact with each other in ways that are much more complex and subtle than I've been able to detect yet, in terms of just looking at the literature and talking to people. But I'm still working on it. Okay, we talked about this, I think. That's okay. Okay. Yes, I did it again, so I anticipate myself. So here are some of the fundamental characteristics of the Toyota product development system. As I said before, everyone who touches or is touched by a product during its life is involved in its design. And to concretize that, make it a little more explicit. So what they do is they make a clay model. It's called a clay model. I think in many cases these days they're doing different types of materials, and also using digital modeling, perhaps in addition to the physical modeling. But they start the project doing that modeling, but they engage people down in manufacturing, the design of the powertrain, right? People that you might think, well, what's that have to do with the shape of the car? Well, all the things that everybody else does has to fit within that shape, right? So they're engaged even from the beginning, and they have a method of kind of progressively constructing in design, right? The automobile trying to pay attention to the impact of decisions made early on decisions that have to be made later, right? And so that's why it's so important to have this integrated team approach as opposed to introducing people into the project just at the point where their specific work is to be done. Because at that point, it's going to be too late, or it's just too expensive, or will be very expensive to make changes that, if anticipated earlier, would not have occurred at all, right? So the second element is design coordination is achieved through set-based concurrent engineering. So concurrent engineering was developed really around this idea of organizational integration, integrated team approach. But they discovered in the efforts to do that they needed some way to manage the design process. And they call that set-based concurrent engineering. And then the last feature is that the chief engineer of each product development project is the guardian of customer value. And and what, see if I can say this without taking too long about it. Well, I think maybe you've heard or read the story about, and it's not a very glamorous one, it's talking about the Toyota Sienna, which is a van, right? Not a sexy sports car or a glorious, luxurious car, just a workaday van. But I've forgotten the name of the chief engineer, but the chief engineer for that project personally led an experimentation. They took it to every different environment on the face of the planet that they could think of, not only physical, but social, economic, right? And that informed their design of that automobile, right? So the guardian of customer value, you've got to really understand. And in product development, it's a little, well, both of them are tricky, right? But tricky in different ways. But in product development, you don't have a specific customer, you have a type of customer, right? But ultimately, that type of customer gets to pick from the product that you design. And in construction, the challenge comes perhaps the interesting challenge is that it's a very specific customer with very specific needs and wants, right? And more challenging, but just as it is, Toyota product development and construction share the interesting problem of integrating stakeholder expectations, right, and requirements. So, okay, so what I want to do is just progressively list key points. And when we have them all, then we'll be done. So key point A, target value delivery is a process for setting and steering to project targets that deliver value to stakeholders within their constraints. Target value delivery is a result of several historical influences, cost planning, and then Hatala's contribution to that, which I'll explain much more detail later. Japanese target costing exemplified by Toyota's product development system, and the Bolt Company's experimentation since 2002, that's the St. Olaf's project, with applying target costing in construction. So now to the mechanics of the problem. So how are targets set? How is design steered to targets, and how is construction steered to targets? Okay. So you may have seen this before. I don't think this image, I know the image isn't in the reference here. It was a report produced for the UK's National Health Service in 1998. And the specific ratios aren't as so important as the level of difference between the costs. So if you look at it from left to right, you see small circles, progressively bigger circles, right? The big circle on the right is the outcomes, healthcare outcomes that might be wanted from a hospital project, right? The brown next biggest circle, and all the remaining circles to the left are costs, right? So if we put the cost for a project, the unit cost as a construction is 1. If its cost of construction is amounts to 1, then design would be something like 1/10 of that, 0.1, right? In this report, they propose that over a 20-year life of operating and maintaining the hospital, they would have a cost of about 4.3. And in that same 20 years, the business cost for delivering healthcare in the hospital would be something like a 42, right? And then the value of the outcomes, the benefits, if you will, of the big blue circle on the right have to exceed, so in area, that has to be greater than the sum of the areas in the circles, right? The cost circles. Otherwise, it's not economically sustainable. And what I would suggest that I really like this diagram. If you don't get down into the weeds, obviously the ratios are going to change a bit depending upon the building, even, and certainly the building type and the specific building. But it's the order of magnitude that directs our attention to what's most important, right? And so one kind of inference to draw is that we should be very careful not to reduce design cost in a cost-cutting effort without regard to its impact on all the rest of the circles, right? And another feature is that it looks at the whole life, the use of the facility, right? So it's really a whole life perspective, and not just, sometimes life cycle is used to express that, but it's also used, unfortunately, to simply refer to operations and maintenance, right? But as you can see, the business costs to deliver healthcare in the building are significantly outweigh even O&M. Right? And so I think of this as a visual argument for the claim, the proposition that the natural target for a construction project is net benefits in use. Right? And I think that's what target costing does. You're not just setting a target for a cost, right? You're setting a target for a ratio between benefits and cost. And if you change those expected benefits through a reduction or an expansion in scope, then you change that allowable cost. So I present this because some of these concepts are important for what we go on to say. So I'm thinking now at the beginning of a project, I'm going to call that, I know it has different names in different places, but I'm going to call that first phase of a project definition, right? And I think that's what we called it in the earliest descriptions of the lean product delivery system, right? LPDS. In that phase, it starts with an idea, a gleam in the eye. Someone has an idea, or provoked by a problem, perhaps, to a go, no-go decision for a specific project. And so how do we move from that idea to that decision? So, and obviously, this is going to be somewhat broad brush. So we have to ask and answer several key questions. The first one is, what benefits are wanted? The second is, what is the lowest acceptable ratio of benefits to costs, the allowable cost? How does this project compare to others as an investment alternative, if that's important to you? In some cases it is, in some cases it isn't. I had a humorous experience I was really trying to understand the financial management end of the business, and I was working with one of the finance people from Sutter Health, and I kept kind of running into and couldn't really get into, well, how do you decide between this one and that one when you can't always have. At some point, I accidentally or unintentionally or without intent said, well, you know, if funding is limited, then right, you have to make those decisions. And he said, well, as a matter of fact, since I've been working in the last 5 years, we've always had the capital to support our our program for project development, right? So that's a joke on me. Sorry. Okay. So, but in other cases, you will have limitations. How does this project compare to others as an investment alternative? And then given the risks and uncertainties that attend any project, right, can this project be completed successfully? Okay. And then answering those questions involves producing and assessing a business case and identifying and assessing risk and opportunities in project delivery. And I think those of you who attended the last planner webinar earlier in September, I think we did it, will remember that one of the things that we've added to the last planner system is this notion of introducing options in assessing risks and opportunities in project delivery. And okay, so let me just let's try. I've seen this so many times, I tend to go through it too fast, so I'll try not to do that. So let's put this in a diagram showing how things are connected to one another, and also showing iteration, right? Because obviously you don't go through this in a one time through complete, but it's really kind of a dialectical argument that you're trying to do with within yourself. So what do I want? And I is obviously multi-dimensional, right? The customer is always complex. What do I want? What is it worth to me to have it? What am I willing to pay? But then also, what am I able to pay? And that's they're assuming that there's a constraint on funding, right? There'll be a constraint at some point, right? And then how much will it cost, right? And so we already have, in just going down to before the first triangle, first decision box, we have allowable cost, what I'm willing and able to pay. We have expected cost, what it would cost based on the market, right? And to determine expected cost determining expected cost is a form of what we call conceptual estimating when it's done prior to design. And that's the definition of conceptual estimating that I'm using. And I think that's pretty well consistent. There may be differences in different parts of the world, but that's how I'm using it. Okay? So if we get to that point, and then if there may be, so we do then a comparison of expected cost and allowable cost for the given scope, right? What I want. Expressed in, remember the Evans diagram, relative to the benefits that are expected, right? So if the expected cost is less than allowable, right, then it's yes, then you're in good shape, right? Because you're already able, you know that you don't have to, you have some room, right, to perhaps consider value-adding scope, right, and perhaps some flexibility for setting stretch goals. Right? But going back to that EC relative to AC, expected cost versus allowable cost, if expected exceeds allowable, which is the more interesting case, of course, because it's a problem that needs solving, right? Then you have to make some type of assessment. And I'd say, can we close the gap, right? Can we close that negative gap between what we're willing and able to pay, and what we expect it's going to cost to do it. And the first kind of a that kind of a decision might be, we answer the question, is it feasible to close that gap? If it's definitely not, then we either revise, we loop back to the expectations of benefits, what do I want? Or we stop the project, right? And it may well be that too few projects that get to this point are stopped or even revised. And of course, those are headed for, they're going to be a struggle if they succeed at all. And then if you think it is feasible, it may be, then that calls for validation. And that's what I reported about in developing a project execution plan and testing it for the viability of overcoming risks in the project. That was from the Last Planner system, the extension of Last Planner to managing the whole project. So, so this validation, so let's talk about validation. Let's see, where are we here? Let me look at my notes again. Whizzing along. Pardon me. Okay. If I turn the pages, okay. So let's go look at this. So this is actually from another Sutter Health project. It turned out to be about a $1.5 billion hospital built in the middle of San Francisco. And so, and this is an example of the benchmarking approach to to conceptual estimating, right? So what they did was they had, I think, 9 different projects. They identified 9 projects that were somewhat similar in size and functionalities to the one that they were planning. And then they made adjustments to that, because they had the actual cost and the actual scope of those projects. And then they made adjustments to them to bring them into alignment with the functionalities and capacities required of their hospital, and of course, time and place. And they determined that there was a difference of, well, they set their target cost at 14% below the average determined from this assessment of the market, right? So let's look at some key points. That's what we had before. Now we've got allowable cost is not an estimate. It's not a cost estimate at all, but rather what a client's willing and able to pay to get what they want. It involves an estimate, but the estimate is the estimate of benefits, right, in relation to which this cost is allowable. Targets are set through gap analysis of allowable versus expected. Expected cost is set by benchmarking similar buildings, or, and we'll talk about this in connection with the current research on target value delivery that we're doing, or by modeling what's wanted and costing the model. Decisions to fund a project consider feasibility if the project can be delivered with acceptable risk. Okay, so let's go to steering to targets. So to decide if to fund this project, only the total project target cost is needed, right? That doesn't work for steering design because design decisions are made by system and component, so the target cost must be allocated accordingly. And as we saw in the very first, in the St. Olaf's example, that allocation has to be provisional because we don't, we will have some basis for allocating that cost. But there are two things that one thing that can happen is that we misunderstand the scope for that function, right, and our system, and maybe that's involves the foundation of the building, right, as was the case in St. Olaf's. But it also may be that in design we come up with an idea that has so much impact on benefits that it shifts the costs around, right? And so we're interested not in making the structure of the building cost exactly what we've allocated its budget to be, but rather in making design decisions about the structure of the building that contribute to delivering the desired value in the appropriate ratio to cost of the whole building, right? So, and target cost allocation to systems and compounds doesn't work for construction, right? Because that's not how they're built. They're built in chunks, right? And so we need to be able to allocate the project target cost to work packages, right? Perhaps contracts even, and some, depending upon the commercial terms of the project. So this is this idea of steering. Now, I really regret for several reasons not being there in person, because it would be really interesting to have a discussion about this, and that can probably only happen in person, but we'll try later on. But but this is a quote from Ari Pennanen of Hattala, and he's I'll just read it. Cooperation between two models, the cost model and the BIM model, forms a steering mechanism in the design phase. Goals, fast feedback loops, and transparent platform for decision making. Cooperation ensures creativity in design and steering within target cost. Okay? So this one, it's kind of got this a little bit out of place. I apologize, but because I think this might fit better when we talk about current research. But at any rate, however you do it, right? What you need to be able to do is to have rapid estimating, cost estimating of the cost implications of a design. And in addition to, of course, understanding its implications for delivering the functionality and at desired quality levels of the system or component. Excuse me. I'm talking too much. Okay. So what? If we go back to these cross-functional target value delivery teams, thinking about the design phase, right? So one of the things that we require of them is that they have internally estimating capability, right? And and so that they're and periodically there's, and I'm sure this is common practice in everywhere, but just as you're doing model reviews, right, you're simultaneously reporting. So you're not just reporting how the model, the part of the model that you have responsibility for, how that's progressing and changed over time, but you're also reporting cost at the same time. Right? And you do that in all team meetings where everyone takes their turn according to preset rotation. On the big hospital project in San Francisco with Sutter Health Hospital I mentioned earlier, I was involved quite a bit in the design phase of that project, and I think what they did was every 3 weeks each team would report, both do a cost review and a cost review simultaneously. Right? So now, why I have this here is a little bit perhaps puzzling, but one thing that's so when we're evaluating a design alternative or evaluating alternative designs for something specific, right? perhaps a mechanical system, right, or air conditioning system. So there's this process for evaluating and choosing from alternatives that's being applied in the design phase consistently now in the United States, at least. And it's called choosing by advantages. And I'm not sure if that's something that's known about or understood. Probably is. But in any case, it's relevant, right, to what we're talking about here. And this is the basic steps in choosing by advantages. You identify alternatives, obviously, and we're now using it in a little bit different way than this lays out. This assumes that you already have alternatives that you're considering. Then you identify the factors that are relevant to for evaluating the alternatives. But obviously, the alternatives should best have been generated with understanding of the factors, right? So we're trying to use CBA now as really as a design generation tool as well as a design evaluation tool. But let's just think about it for a moment as evaluation. So define the factors. I'm going to give an example and right after this, but just go through the process. Define must have, won't have criteria for each factor. Describe the attributes of each alternative, the advantages of each alternative, the importance of each advantage, and evaluate cost data. And you notice here that cost comes last. So you're doing that in order to be able to make a value versus cost decision. Right? So, and that's what's called value for money. So let's see what example. I think I've got a small example. So this is from a student of mine who's long past being a student now, but she did her PhD dissertation on choosing by advantages and in its application and making design decisions. And so you can see as a factor, square feet of mechanical space required, access for maintenance. This is a study of a heating hot water system. Quantity of boilers and standby, ability to do boiler stack heat recovery, pumping energy, and then the construction schedule implications, right? And so, and then, you can look at this more closely at your leisure, but what we're doing is we're acting on the principle that if we can't agree on how things are how they match up to the factors, then we can't really come to agreement about which one's better or worse, right? And so it's designed as for situations where there are competing pulls and tugs, right, of different things, and the expectation is that the people making the decisions will tend to have favorites. Right? And so we're trying to in order to avoid getting to an argument about, which essentially it comes down to, well, your God's ugly. That's not so important. What I believe is important is more important than what you believe is important. If you confer that in a consensus about, well, what are the facts, right? And if we think that once you have those, you've done that assessment of the attributes, then that might spur you to go back and to do some more generation of alternatives. Right? So it's not just, as I mentioned earlier, what we're looking at is this, we're trying to be realistic about the design process. It's not just cookie cutting, right? It's not something that's that just goes in a linear fashion, but rather we're trying to engage the right people, look at the right criteria for evaluation. What are we trying to accomplish? What's the appropriate way to assess this, right? And then work to get those people to agree among themselves on which one's best. And ultimately, that comes down to, and I'm sorry to use an automobile example that's I could find online, but so here we can look at and this is so extreme, but we're looking at on the vertical dimension the importance of advantages, right? And we're looking on the horizontal dimension at the cost of obtaining those advantages, the benefits, right? And so in this case, a Toyota Camry versus a Mercedes C-Class versus a BMW SUV, XS SUV, and obviously this is very extreme. It may not reflect the elements of your enjoyment of driving, right? Or the desire to outdo the Joneses. But that's all a subject is available for argumentation. But ultimately, if we have an agreement about what benefits are provided and what the cost is to acquire those benefits, then we have a basis for a decision. Excuse me. Okay. So this is just going back into the lean philosophy, if you will. So we've been talking a lot about customers, internal and external, and we're trying to, as you know, the lean ideal is to give those customers exactly what they need to accomplish their purposes with no waste. And obviously this is aspirational, right? Because it's always possible to deliver more value, and it's always possible to eliminate more waste, right? And it will always be. Well, but I got to thinking about, and other people have thought about this as well, it's not just my invention. So who's the customer? And I suggest that a customer that everyone has is the next person after you in a process. Right? In the context of a project, the paying customer is obviously a customer, but there are other stakeholders, both internal to the paying customer organization, right? Let's say the difference between engineering and manufacturing, right? And there are external stakeholders, say neighborhood associations who don't want your building to block out their light. And then I think if we spin this all the way out, we really can talk about the planet itself as a customer in the sense of someone who touches or is touched by what we do in our projects. Right? So just as an aside, I've come to believe that the lean philosophy is guided really by this lean ideal is really the best way that we humans have as yet developed for pursuing the triple bottom line of sustainability. And although the focus has historically been on the economic leg of that triplet, I think the social and the environmental belong there as equally as well. Okay, so still thinking about how do you make these design decisions? And one of the things, if we go back to target costing in manufacturing in Toyota, there's a big stress in that world on value engineering. And I'm not sure what it's the reputation of value engineering has in Denmark, but in the United States, it tends to be seen very negatively. And I think it's seen negatively because of the way it's used, not because of what it is. But it's used most commonly in the US to evaluate a produced design, right? In an attempt to fine-tune it, refine it, right? And it tends to be done not by the people who produce that design, but by an external team of people. But in Target, the way Toyota does it is not that at all. Value engineering is part of the way the design is produced, right? And so the basis of, or the key part of value engineering for our purposes here is So is this idea that of function analysis, right? And so function analysis was developed, as I understand it, in connection with wartime production in the United States War II. And at that time, as you can well imagine, certain types of materials like rubber and iron, glass even maybe, were scarce. And because the demands of wartime production were sucking up those resources very rapidly. And so General Electric, I think it was General Electric, developed a process called function analysis that was intended to provide the same functionality at less cost. And in its origin, it focused on really material selection, right? What could we make things out of? But that was just one aspect of it. And generally speaking, the idea is that what it exemplifies, I think, is a fundamental to the nature of design, that there is always a potential for the delivery of value in a different and better way. Right? And it's that potential that drives us, right? And makes possible the reduction in waste. Right? So this is just an example from the United States in the public facilities, the use of value engineering, and this is in millions of US dollars. And this is, I think this is not current, this is some years ago. But nonetheless, you can see that it's taken very seriously at that level of cost management. So I recommend that we really go back in and look at using value engineering tools in that design generation, not simply in design evaluation, so that we have better things to evaluate. And that's of course, in the service of delivering expected benefits within the target cost.